welcome everyone here in the Schönfeld Lecture Hall, and also for those who are following the event online. It's great to have you here, and in particular it's wonderful to have our guest of honor, because without him we wouldn't have any lecture. So I'm pleased to welcome Professor Jakob Zeischler as our inaugural lecturer of today, and I'm also greeting members of the TUD community and guests. As you know, in this series we are introducing strategically relevant professors to the TUD community, and Professor Zeischler's professorship is one of these strategically important professorships, and we will hear more about this from the Dean of the school, our colleague Professor Krebs, and I will not take this away from him. Let me say a couple of words about some content and how the topic of Professor Zeischler's research is crucial for us. Climate change and the climate crisis, as we like to call it most often, is of course in the center of attention, or it should be at least, for all of us, because it's the future of the planet. And we as TUD have pledged with a ecologically sustainability strategy that was passed through the Senate many months ago to do our share as an organization as far as we're able to contribute, but also in our research endeavors we want to contribute to providing ideas for solutions to this very complex and crucial issue. And I can tell you it is distributed across many faculties. So of course at the center of attention today is our Faculty of Environmental Science, but I'm very happy to say that our Faculty of Civil Engineering is very much engaged in sustainability issues, and the same is true for our Faculty of Electrical and Mechanical Engineering. And all of these do very well know that many of the products and the materials that they are researching and producing and putting forward so far have contributed to CO2 emission, to energy consumption, to using resources that are scarce, and all of that has to change in the future, and they are working conjointly on it. And one more testimony to our concerted effort is that two of our new excellence cluster initiatives that have been invited to provide a full proposal are focused on sustainability issues, one in the field of electrical engineering, electronics, and one in the field of construction and civil engineering. So this is just, to provide some backing to my claim that climate crisis is at the center of our attention. And we are focusing on these issues not alone, because it's a very good tradition here in Dresden that we network in Dresden Concept, but even beyond Dresden Concept, we have very important partners. And one of those partners is here today from the Helmholtz Center close to Leipzig for environmental research. And I'm welcoming Professor Borchardt, who will also say a couple of words about this joint appointment which Professor Zeischler constitutes. Last but by no means least, and it's already bridging into the very heart of the subject matter of Jakob Zeischler, it is that we are, as a university, not only pledging to provide solutions for the climate crisis, but also to use digitization and to very much embrace the data intensity of almost all disciplines that we have represented on our campus, to make the most of this data intensiveness and to make the most of digitization. And that's why we are really very, very proud that we are the center and the headquarter of the National Data Infrastructure for Earth, NFDI for Earth, and I'm very pleased that its PI, Lars Bernhard, is here with us today, and by training he is a very important important member of the Faculty of Environmental Science, of course, but he is also a cherished member of the Rectorate as the Chief Officer of Digitization and Information Management. So I think this brings together the many bits and pieces how at TUD we are approaching these issues research-wise. And I think when it comes to gaining a better understanding and thereby handling of the climate crisis, we cannot do without data, we cannot do without modeling, we cannot do without simulation. And in order to being able to do this, we first need to have precise measurement. And so all of this has a very well-established home here at TU Dresden, and it's my very pleasure to see how well Jakob Zeischler's research fits into this nest that has been created for him to make the most with his modeling and simulation and prognostic tools. And he is indeed investigating climate-related impact in a socio-ecological setting, because that's what it is. Climate is not happening in isolation. It is a highly complex system which represents interactions between physical drivers and societal forces. And we need to get into a position to model these interactions in order to be able to predict more appropriately and more accurately step by step. So this implies very close cooperation across disciplinary boundaries, and we are proud to say that here at TU Dresden these boundaries have been shrinking as we speak over the last decades. We have a very porous system and closely knit network of our disciplines that work together on problems, work together to solve problems. So I think when you want to study complex phenomena, I'm a developmental scientist. I studied human functioning across the life course. It's a highly complex system, deeply embedded in many different layers, in the similar way as the climate is embedded in so many different layers. I think when you do this, you realize that you need to have paradigms to get closer to the phenomenon. And one paradigm, interestingly, that works very well for the study of human functioning across the lifespan is what we call a testing the limits, a stress approach, because you can study systems under extreme conditions even more clearly. It's like a magnifying glass, if you wish. And it seems that you are studying impact or predicting weather extremes, climate extremes, which in a way is a similar thing, maybe only in a loose analogy, but I thought this was really interesting when you study droughts that create crop failures, when you study forest mortality because of droughts, when you study the damage that floods have been creating. So I'm really looking forward to learning more during your lecture. I hope that I haven't gone wrong in my prediction. And I think your scientific pathway, your scientific career is ideally suited and prepared you very well, starting out with studying mathematics and then switching to environmental system science and going to ETH for your postdoc right into the heart of climate science. So we are extremely happy and proud that we were able to attract you to this location in the world together with UFZ as a more than viable partner, and looking forward to the future things to come, how you make use of machine learning and also our facilities as one of the national centers in artificial intelligence together with the University of Leipzig. Yes, I think that's what I wanted to say, and welcome you from very cordially here as a member of our TUD community, and at the same time welcoming members of your family, your parents, I learned, and your wife is here and your children waiting downstairs later to join us. So this is wonderful because this is what we are all about. We are not only an ecology of research institutions, we are also an ecology of social networks. And no top-level science can be produced without the network supporting it. And so let us all give a hand to the family Zeischler being here and becoming a member of our community. So, with having said this, before we are able to listen to all the fascinating things that Jakob will tell us, we will get an introduction from the Dean of the school, Professor Krebs, and then followed by a laudatio of Professor Borchert. And then we have the lecture, and afterwards, like always, we have a reception downstairs. And let me thank the people who made all of this happen. I was told that Mandy Arndt was making the things move from the environmental science side, and Christine Milkau and our colleagues from Communication Office, my Chief of Protocol, Christine Milkau, and Communications help us with the live stream and advertisement and so forth. So thank you very much, and handing it over to you, please.
Now, dear Rector, dear Vice Rectors, Dietrich, dear colleagues, and most importantly, dear Jakob, I will start with the events that are the core part of your research. Imagine a river flood event to happen that was never observed before. Imagine a drought period that was extended longer than ever before, causing an enormous harvest loss. Imagine a pollution event causing extremely toxic effects to aquatic life, or imagine wildfires increasing in their frequencies. All this happened in the past. So what is the cause for such environmental extremes? They are happening in the environment, they can be observed, and they can hardly be explained nor predicted. We tend to think in simple cause-effect relationships, meaning that we have a univariate interaction between cause and effect. And as long as this is true, we have extreme value statistics that work rather well. However, if you look at some of the extreme events we had in the recent past, they would come up with a return period of 1,000 years or more. So that's where the classical conventional extreme value statistic fails. So again and again, we face events that cannot be captured by these statistical approaches. And it is quite simple to see and to realize that other things happen. Now another list of some examples that was originally much longer is told to you. A rapid temperature increase combined with a long and large-scale rain event may cause snow melt, and on top the entire catchment is more than saturated, and that is causing an extreme event that is higher than would be predicted by a univariate statistic analysis. Heat after a long, extremely dry period makes forests much more sensitive and less resilient, and will cause harvest losses because harvest is suffering from that as well. An extremely intense rain event after a long dry weather period, and the rain event is not only extreme with regard to its intensity, but it's rather small, and the local event may cause spills from urban wastewater systems and may cause agricultural surfaces to be eroded, causing toxic effects in the river. So the extreme here is a chemical extreme, is a pollution extreme. So two or more drivers, each of them capable to cause an extreme event are coinciding, that's when compound events are occurring. So the Faculty of Environmental Sciences at TU Dresden, of course, deals with environmental extremes. We are experienced in monitoring, in data processing, in modeling, used for predictions and forecasting and projection, and this under the changing and dynamic boundary conditions of climate change or of global change in general. Compound effects will keep us busy for the next decades. Jakob Zeischler is an expert in this. He is a major player in investigating compounding effects with his group. His work is on developing new explanatory models. Methodologic developments for improving predictions are in the foreground, so it's not about explaining one single event or a specific event to understand what happened there. It's a generic approach in order to understand what happens, what's going on, and what is the general key to explain what happens in the background of compound events. May it be with advanced statistical methods or with machine learning. For the New Excellence Initiative, the emerging field water will deal with forest water dynamics, so it's not an emerging field water anymore. It was originally an emerging field water, but now we are widening our perspective, our horizon, and including more environmental systems because they are heavily interacting. Forest and water are not to be separated because forests are heavily influencing the river basin water balance, and also water are just needed for healthy forests, of course, and for resilient forests. So, of course, having said this, it's quite normal and logic that Jakob Zeischler finds himself in the core part of our faculty with his topic, and also, consequently, he is already a core group member of this new emerging field initiative. So the basis for joint appointment is also, and I'm not coming late to UFZ because it's not so important, but that's the storyline then, handing over to you the word, between UFZ, Helmholtz Center for Environment Research in Leipzig, Halle and Magdeburg, and our faculty. We have 20 years of experience, including international projects, including common infrastructures, research infrastructures, in parts also common strategy development, and most importantly, it's about joint appointments. Jakob Zeischler is the fourth joint appointment between UFZ and our faculty. Among these four, I'm sorry for the other ones, Jakob is standing for the future, of course, and with his department, he is heading at UFZ with the title of Compound Environmental Risks, and the dedication of his chair here at TU Dresden, Data Analytics in Hydrosciences. He will build up new and strong links between the two institutions. I'm very positive that this is going to happen. New topics in new ages, that's what we expect here. Well, we are the past, sorry, and you are the future. Beyond our faculty at TU Dresden, there are many more synergy potential to be identified, and our rector mentioned already a couple of these. That's Synosis, Center for Synergy of Systems. It's the Center for Scalable Data Analytics and Artificial Intelligence, KCAI, that was founded together jointly with the University of Leipzig. It's a Center for Advanced Systems Understanding, CASUS, only a couple of years ago being funded between Helmholtz institutions and TU Dresden, and not least it's NFDI for Earth that is coordinated here at TU Dresden. You see, expectations are high. But it's not only about expectations and performance indicators. I think I'm allowed to state that we are simply nice guys and nice colleagues. So you're coming into a nice environment. We warm-heartedly welcome you at TU Dresden, and we are all looking forward to joint research, to joint projects, and maybe to a beer after the project's discussions have been finalized. All the best.
Dear Rector and dear Vice Rector, dear Peter, dear Jakob. So it's my really great honor and pleasure to introduce a few perspectives from this joint affiliation with the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, and it's really a great pleasure to do this for you, Jakob. And I just was thinking about history past or so. There were some notions I can personally say because I was the first of these joint appointments, I think. And Jakob, I can tell you the many years I had in this joint appointment were the most enjoyable in my scientific life. So I wish you the same, and hopefully your development, but I'm sure will develop in the same way. Having said this, of course, I also want to say that, from the perspective, and I'm talking from a natural science perspective because I'm a biologist, but had to learn that the topics you are working with very complex systems as well. These ecosystems, these aquatic ecosystems, with the many layers there, have a lot to do with what you really developed, I should say, as a new interdisciplinary field in environmental research. These compound events in climate trickling and down to the water cycle, for example, but also to other interferences. And I think this is also a perspective I developed, I learned over many years, that these interfaces are the most exciting ones, and that the ones that you choose, there's the climate research, the climate impact research, but also the data science with all the revolution we are facing is really a big challenge. And but at the same time, it's something that we particularly have to address because of the severe damage to the environment that was already mentioned, to nature, I should say, and to the society as well. And we heard about important linkages with these new phenomena, both in their, let's say, in their nature, but also in their statistics, these simultaneous drought and heat, and the simultaneous flooding we just saw in winter at huge scales, never seen before, across several regions, and extreme precipitation event following in short sequences. Something is going on there. And you were lucky, I think, with your choice to develop your scientific curiosity into this direction. Who 10 years ago would have expected such a relevance, such an impact, such a severeness that you obviously felt, I suppose, when you developed in this direction. And I want to add one aspect which I maybe may highlight what is really going on here, because also the discussion some years ago was, this is far away, this is not Germany, this is not Central Europe, but somewhere else in the world, far enough distance to that. But and this was really also, I think, a kind of wake-up call that when we look at the last 5 to 6 years, there was at the beginning of this year a study inventory from the Prognos Institute, and they came to the bill of 80 billion euros of damage since 2018, between 2018 and 2021, half of which related to flooding and flood-related damage, the other half to drought and these events. And if you face this number, 20 billion a year of damage which happened, and you see the discussions we have at the moment about the budget of Germany and the political debates about it, I think this is very clear. what the relation and significance is. And I think, yes, you are excellently qualified to conduct this research. And I also learned that it's somehow coming back to the roots. Your high school degree you received here in Dresden. It was the Kreuzschule, I think, if I'm informed rightly. Your Vordiplom in mathematics, also from TU Dresden. And then you made your career to Max Planck Institute's carbon cycle, biogeochemistry in Dresden, and to ETH. Peter and I, we also have some good memory to ETH and and EAWAC and so on. So I think, again, a very good decision. And I don't know if there's anybody else who acquired this relevant knowledge about the atmosphere, the climate processes, these weather impacts with your mathematical skills, which are needed because of the data revolution we have, the data science we need to deal this. And therefore, I think also the denomination of your professorship in data analytics and hydroscience here in Dresden is a very clear statement. And as you have said, we are especially lucky, I think, in the same way, and really appreciate that you are now leading a department at UFZ, which is on compound environmental risks. And this is a perfect underpinning of our agenda as UFZ, working in our programs, and therefore you really are and provide a significant basis to the future agenda that we have on Earth and environment, and the research and the ambitions that we want to find pathways for the society to cope with, on the one hand side, the global change, but at the same time, prosperity and livelihood for people. And here, as I said, your research is definitely at the core of that. And therefore the UFZ, and also I'm personally, I have to say, still working for some time in the future. I'm really looking forward to this continued fruitful cooperation between TU Dresden at the one hand side and UFZ, with maybe Jakob as a catalyst, I hope, in providing this, what we need, and this, we share this ambition, TU Dresden and UFZ at the one hand side, really achieve cutting-edge science, really at the forefront of science, which is needed especially in environmental science, the fact base for all the societal processes in this. And at the same time, work on a topic which is really a societal challenge, a first-order societal challenge, I should say. And here you are. And therefore, I wish you, again, very good luck for all your endeavors in this respect, and I think we all can very much look forward to this lecture, and I'm sure that will give us some surprises, insights in the really exciting topic of your work in terms of content, methodology, and the significance. Thank you very much. Jakob.
Thank you very much, dear Rector, dear Peter and Dietrich. Thanks for these kind words. Also, dear colleagues, friends, and family, thanks for coming to this lecture. It's my great pleasure now to give this inaugural lecture in this very nice lecture hall. And my talk is entitled Towards Understanding Extreme Climate Impacts. And I would like to start talking a bit about the last year, 2023, which was really a year truly of extremes. And one feature of that year that is maybe not so well known in the general public, but widely debated in the scientific community, are these record-breaking sea surface temperatures that we are now observing since more than a year. So they have become record-breaking more than a year ago, and they are record-breaking every single day since more than 365 days in a row. And you can see that the record is broken not just by a little bit, but by a big margin. we are still figuring out what really the causes of these record-breaking temperature extremes are in the ocean. But of course, also the air temperatures over the year were very high, often record-breaking, and are still very high at the moment. So this is a kind of a more long-term event, you could argue, maybe an entire year. But of course, we also had a lot of smaller regional scale extreme events everywhere in the world. So you could probably fill an entire day just talking about extreme events of 2023. One was this very notable extreme fire event in Canada, starting sometime in spring and going on over the entire summer, emitting a record-breaking amount of carbon to the atmosphere, as can be seen through this green line in this lower figure. An event very relevant for Europe happened in late summer, and was this omega blocking that is actually quite rare in Europe. So we had two low-pressure systems in the Iberian Peninsula and in Greece, and in between a high-pressure system in Central Europe. So we had very extreme rainfall events in Spain, Portugal, but also in Greece. You can see this picture here of this flooded fertile plain in Greece. And at the same time, we had this very nice late summer weather in Central Europe. So you may wonder, is this now an exceptional year? I actually get this question quite often from journalists. So was this now a particularly extreme year? Do we expect this to come in the future, or can we kind of go back to normal? And of course, that's not so easy to say, but to the best of our knowledge, we will experience such years more and more often in the future. Maybe not every year, but probably more frequent than in the past. And if you look at current climate projections, there are, of course, many uncertainties related to the emission pathways, so we can reach a global mean temperature range of up to 5 degrees in the very worst case scenario. It's largely outruled by now. But these big changes in global temperature, they also have really big impacts on societies and ecosystems. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has come up with these reasons for concerns, and they identified 5 reasons for concerns. And one of them is extreme weather events. It's called extreme weather events, and the warmer it gets, the bigger the risks are associated with the extreme weather events. If you look at current policies and the projections associated with those, we would end up at about 2.5 to 2.9 degrees warming at the end of the century. So it's much better than 5 degrees, but it's still more than twice the warming that we have experienced so far, which is at about 1.2, 1.3 degrees maybe. So these extreme weather events, they're put here just like that, but what type of events are we talking about, actually? So if you look into the scientific literature or talk to people who work in this field, so what we typically study are the commonly known extremes, such as droughts, floods, heat waves, extreme frost, storms or hurricanes, and other event types. But I think what we actually want to get at by studying these type of events is we want to predict and especially prevent extreme climate-related impacts on our ecosystems, on agriculture, on our infrastructure, on humans, and so forth. You may argue, well, if we study these extreme events in the climate, then maybe it's kind of approximately also we get some notion about the impacts, and that was kind of this cause-effect relation mentioned earlier. But I want to argue in the following that this is often really not the case. Let's go back to the ocean. Coral reefs. So there was a news a few weeks ago. NOAA confirmed that we are now experiencing the 4th global coral bleaching event, meaning that all over the global oceans, corals are bleaching, and this means that the regional ecosystem may break down, fish don't have anything to eat anymore. And typically, we assume that coral bleaching is very closely related to very hot ocean temperatures, marine heat waves, we call them. So for instance, this is a famous event, it's dubbed the blob. which occurred 2015-16 off the coast of North America and the Pacific, nearly 2 years long, several degrees of very extreme temperature anomalies in the region, with a lot of impacts that were observed at the time. So it was a bit of a surprise. So actually there's a lot of literature now since the last 10 years or so on marine heat waves, their changes, their characteristics, their frequency in the different regions of the ocean. So it was a bit of a surprise then last year when a study came out in Nature showing that there's actually no relationship between marine heat waves and changes in fish biomass. So what might be the reason behind that? So we did a study more or less at the same time based on a fish model where we showed that if you look what drives actually extreme biomass changes in fish. And only in very rare cases these are univariate extreme events. Much more common is that you need some combination of stressors or drivers that then cause these large anomalies and these extreme low biomass events. And if you now go back to the blob, you can actually see that it was not only an extreme heat wave in the ocean, but it was also at very high acidity and low oxygen. So it was kind of a triple extreme event, and these conditions together then probably led to the big impacts that were observed. So let's go back to the land. Ecosystems on land. So how do we study extreme impacts in ecosystems? Typically what ecologists do, they do manipulation experiments. So for instance, if you want to study drought, you can construct such a drought shelter. So you just put a roof somewhere, and then you measure how your grassland, for instance, responds to the drought. And this is now showing a kind of a meta-analysis of lots of these type of studies showing that there's actually a significant reduction in above ground biomass to drought, so the grasses produce much less biomass. But if you compare this to observational evidence, so you just look at droughts that occur in nature and measure the anomalies in biomass there, then the effect is actually much larger. So in the real world, these drought impacts seem to be like twice as large as the one that we measure in experiments. Why is that? I would argue that this is because in the real world, droughts don't occur in isolation. They occur usually together with heat waves. So there's a strong physical mechanism that links droughts and heat waves. There are strong feedbacks between droughts and heat waves. And so when we do these manipulation experiments where we exclude the rain, we actually only change the rain, but this is not a situation that typically occurs in nature. You might argue maybe this is only happening regionally, but this is actually something that we observe everywhere globally on land. So dry and hot conditions are strongly correlated. And so they occur much more often together than what we would expect if we would assume no correlation between temperature and precipitation. We also know that the co-occurrence of droughts and heat waves lead to very strong damages in ecosystems. In a study during my PhD, I showed that the compound impact of droughts and heat waves is much larger than the sum of the univariate impacts of only droughts or only heat waves in terms of ecosystem carbon uptake. And more recently, it was shown that globally, tree mortality events are typically associated with concurrent hot and dry conditions in the year of when the trees die. Another example, going more into the impacts, is are events such as the 2016 crop failure in France, where we have an extreme impact. We observe something very extreme happening in a system. In this case, we have a record-breaking low yield here. So in France, in that year, they had very low wheat yields compared to all the other years, 60 years before. And it was completely unclear what had caused these low wheat yields. There was no obvious weather extreme in the growing season, so it was not really clear what happened. So I hope that these three cases make the point that there's no clear one-to-one link between climate extremes and extreme impacts. This is also illustrated by this relatively simple crop model-based study, where a crop model was run just forced by growing degree days, kind of some temperature proxy for 2,000 seasons. And you can see on the left side that extremely low yields, so this red area, does not necessarily coincide with extremely high growing degree seasons shown by the orange bars. And the other way around, on the right side, in this orange area where we have extreme growing degree season years, they don't coincide with extreme impacts, so with the red bars. So if studying extreme events doesn't really help us that much to gain understanding about impacts, what can we do? Actually, this insight is not new to the scientific community, and because of that, the concept of compound events has been developed about 7-8 years ago. And so compound events actually refer to a combination of multiple drivers or hazards that contribute to some impact or create some impact or contribute to societal or environmental risk. And so in climate science, risk is a result of the interaction between hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. And vulnerability and exposure are typically related to non-climatic factors, so socioeconomic factors, whereas with hazards, we refer to kind of the traditional climate hazards, droughts, heat waves, and so forth. And with compound events, we want to better understand what drives these hazards, what are the multiple combinations between these hazards, but also are there correlations, dependencies between hazards that then contribute to impacts. And Peter Krebs has actually already mentioned a lot of these type of events that would fall into this concept. Compound events can be extremely diverse. So you can think about some sort of climate-related impact and can always put this into this framework. So I just want to mention a few of those and showcase this diversity. This year we had a very late frost event in Saxony, Thuringia, Austria, quite a few places in Central Europe. And this hit the fruit sector, but also the wine sector really hard, especially in Saxony. This here shows an image where the wine growers lit small fires, trying to mitigate the frost damage to the grapes. It didn't really work that well, and the estimated damage for Saxony is actually 70% to 100% of grapes lost. And why was the damage so large in this case? And this is because we had earlier in the year very warm conditions so that the plants could already flower, sprout. We had early leaf development, so if you looked out at the trees, you could see they were flowering, they were greener much earlier this year compared to other years. And this is something we call a preconditioned event. So we had a precondition, this early leaf development, which was driven by warm temperatures. And then we had the cold front, like kind of a second climate driver that then caused this frost. And only because of this precondition, the damage was so large. It's actually something that happens quite frequently in recent years in Central Europe. A very different event was the 2002 floods in Central Europe. It was in Dresden. It was kind of a once in a century event. I was just in my last year of high school, Dresden, so I helped filling these sand sacks and so on. So we had no school for quite some time. But not only Dresden was affected, but a lot of other regions in the neighboring regions, even in different countries. So the regions couldn't help each other in the emergency response. So later, this event actually helped or led to the creation of the European Union Solidarity Fund to kind of help when these events occur. So this is an event that we would call a spatially compounding event, where the characteristic is that we have some larger region or multiple regions, and we have hazards kind of co-occurring at the same time in these regions, and then because of the aggregated impact, we have a big damages. now we have this concept and we have these very complex events, but how do we actually find these drivers? So these are case studies now where you can tell a nice story, but more systematically, how do we find drivers of large impacts events? So we have the climate on the one side and these extreme impacts on the other side. One thing you can do is you just create a large set of potential predictors, for instance, averages, monthly or seasonal averages of weather variables such as temperature or precipitation, and then you select those that best predict the impact using some statistical approach, for instance. This has been done for this 2016 crop failure event in France. So you can see here the distribution of the seasonal averages of temperature maxima for the year of the event and all the other years in the box plot, and then also the monthly distributions. And you can see that the season of the event, the year of the event, actually featured a very warm December. If you look at precipitation, you can do the same calculation. We had a very wet May in that year. Well, so these are not very typical extreme events that you would study as a climate scientist. It turns out that together, these events really led to this crop failure. So we had this warm December that led to some diseases on the plants already, and then this very wet spring that led to waterlogging, and then also other diseases, and then together they caused this big crop failure event. This is something we would call a temporally compounding event, because we have this sequence of drivers or hazards that then kind of combine to create an impact. In this study, they used a relatively simple statistical approach, so-called logistic regression. It's basically like a linear model. In my group, we try something more sophisticated, and we try to use machine learning to address the same question. So we feed machine learning models with a lot of weather information, and then we try to predict impacts. And then the idea is to kind of try to understand what this model has learned. So try to generalize some insights from this model, and then gain new knowledge about the system. This is actually the domain of explainable machine learning, kind of a very prominent current research topic in computer science. There are a lot of challenges with that. So we need a lot of data to train these models. We don't really know how well these models generalize to other domains, how robust they are. If we change some things, climate is, for instance, changing continuously. And the interpretability of these models is also very difficult traditionally. So one thing we do is we work a lot with simulated data to test new approaches. So for instance, one project that we work on is on the question, how can we identify drivers of crop failure events with interpretable machine learning? And for this, to test new ideas, we use data from crop model simulations, from global gridded crop model simulations, and then test these new approaches. So here in this image, you can see one patch in the crop model LPJML. So you have these kind of small patches of grasses and crops and trees, some stream going through. And then for this model, we have then decades of simulated data at the global scale, and then we can analyze this. When we apply machine learning techniques, we usually need some way to test how well these tools work. So, and this is done through cross-validation. So we usually train the models on some subset of the data and predict on withheld subsets. So in this case, for instance, we train the models on all the blue boxes and predict the white boxes to evaluate how well the model works. And there are different strategies to do this subsetting. So one standard approach is called k-fold. So we just split the data into k different folds. But for spatial temporal data, there are also other strategies. For instance, you can remove an entire spatial domain, some regional data, or entire temporal domain, some time steps in the data. We also came up with a new strategy where we split the data into different clusters in the feature space. So here are shown two different features. They're related in some way. And then we cluster this space and we predict in all. So we train the model on all but one cluster, but make predictions on the remaining cluster. If you now look at model performance with these different strategies, For the k-fold, so in this case we use 20-fold cross-validation, we get a very high estimate of our model performance, whereas for the feature cluster approach, we get quite moderate performance. But if we now test this model in a new environment that really the model hasn't seen before, so actually we secretly withheld some more data from the model before we started all of this, then we can see that the model performance based on k-fold cross-validation is strongly overestimating the true model performance. So in a way, this feature cluster approach gives us a more credible model performance. If you now interpret what the model has learned, so this is the true model performance. If you now interpret what the model has learned, we can try to identify what are the features that the model is using for the prediction. And here, in this case, the k-fold cross-validation gives us something like radiation 3 months before sowing was relevant for the prediction. This doesn't really make a lot of sense from a physical perspective, right? And I mean, we are in contact also with the modelers, so we can look in the model code. So in this case, the feature clusters even gives us more credible drivers for our prediction. So overall, cross-validation using this new approach of feature clusters improves our performance estimates, so we get more robust estimates of our models, and we get also more credible drivers. So we also used explainable machine learning to identify compounding drivers of floods. And in this case, we used predictors, rainfall, recent rainfall, temperature, soil moisture, and snowpack, and then predicted discharge peaks or kind of runoff. We did this with a machine learning model. It's called LightGBM. And then, again, we try to understand what the model has learned. We use SHAP interaction values to kind of understand this and get an explanation. And then we look at floods that are caused by multiple drivers versus single drivers, and something that we call flood complexity, and that I will introduce in a minute. So this explanation, actually what we get out of this is how much an interaction or kind of a variable, a predictor, or an interaction between predictors contributed to or was relevant for predicting a given value in the model. And we have here these predictors: rainfall, the day and up to the 6 days before the event, temperature averaged over the last week before the event, and then snowpack and soil moisture 7 days before the event. So and we get this information, and with this we can actually say something about the number of the driver combinations that contributed to the flood through this approach. And we can then divide floods by looking at multiple driver floods, multi-driver floods, or single driver floods. And one result that we saw is that multi-driver floods are typically much larger than single driver floods, especially in dry regions. So the map shows all the different locations where we had data. So it's a few thousand catchments where we had runoff data and could do this analysis. And you can see that in many regions, so it's all red, so the multi-driver floods are always larger than the single driver floods. Well, there's some spatial diversity here. What we could also observe is that in some catchments, we have a very strong relationship between the number of relevant drivers and the flood magnitude, meaning that for more and more extreme floods, you needed more and more drivers to predict this flood well. But this was not the case for other catchments, where we had basically a flat relationship. And so this is something we call flood complexity, because we argue that kind of these catchments where we have this relationship, they make the flood prediction more complex, because we have more different processes, flood generating processes, depending on the magnitude of the flood. And flood complexity on a map looks also has a lot of rich spatial structure. There are some catchments with very high flood complexity values and others with very low. Relatively kind of one relationship that we can get out of this is that typically drier catchments have a higher flood complexity. So why does this matter? When we study floods, we usually want to predict also what could be the most extreme floods that occurs in a given catchment, in a given region, because that's how we build our dams and our flood protection. And this is typically, this approach typically relies on flood frequency analysis. So we typically take the observations that we have from floods and then make predictions about much more extreme floods. So we kind of extrapolate from more moderate floods to more extreme floods. If you now go look at this extrapolation accuracy for different classes of flood complexity, we see that for more heterogeneous flood-generating processes, so for catchments where this is very heterogeneous, so catchments with high flood complexity, we have a strong underestimation of these extreme floods. So in catchments that are very complex, we underestimate extreme floods, which can be a problem for flood protection. So for these catchments, we would need to develop kind of alternative approaches to get to these more extreme floods. So far I've talked mostly about the past and kind of analysis of observed data or simulations, but I started with these climate change projections, and if we look into the future, when we look into the future, we usually we have to rely on climate model simulations. And when we want to study compound events, these are high-dimensional events. We need large amounts of data to make robust statements about their frequency, their magnitude, and so forth. And so, fortunately, a few years ago, climate modeling groups have started to run so-called large ensemble climate model simulations. So, what you see here in this simulation is actually the exact same climate model and the exact same forcing, and they start at the same time, but they have slightly perturbed initial condition, one of them. So they slightly differ in a tiny value somewhere, and then running them forward, they diverge more and more because the weather is chaotic, and so they kind of diverge more and more. And running such a model several times gives us a lot of more samples that we can work with. So we get basically more samples of the weather that could occur in a given climate situation. And we make use of these simulations, for instance, to test uncertainty of our risk estimates. So for instance, if we estimate the frequency of compound hot-dry events on kind of a common databases of 31 years, then if we use two of these type of simulations, the very same model, the very same forcing, in one simulation, in one estimate, we might get a very low risk estimate in the upper panel, and in the other one, a very high one. But this is actually the same climate that we look at here. So this is really the uncertainty in our estimate based on the small sample size and the large variability in the climate system. We can play this game also for other type of events, for instance, compound precipitation and wind extremes in Portugal, or 3-year concurrent droughts in the US. And again, you see this large difference in risk estimates. Well, so this are actually present-day risk estimates. In the future, of course, we also have these large uncertainties. So how can we deal with these type of uncertainties? What is plotted here is the frequency of hot and dry events in Central Europe in a 2-degree warmer world. And you can see this huge range from like 5% to above 30%. But it actually correlates very well with the long-term trend in precipitation, a long-term change in precipitation. So these are different model simulations. And this relationship we can now exploit to create what we call a future climate storyline. So since we cannot reduce this uncertainty, at least not for now, we can work with these storylines, and we can say, okay, if in Central Europe it gets drier in the future, then we will have a very high frequency of these hot and dry summers. Whereas if it gets wetter, which is actually also a reasonable possibility, then these events don't become that frequent in the future. So these relationships can help us to communicate uncertainties better, and maybe also with stakeholders and think about different kind of strategies for planning. So the community of compound event research has very dynamic and has developed very quickly over the last years. But so far, our focus is really on compounding in the climate system, compounding between different weather and climate drivers. But of course, once you go to impacts, there are all these other things that matter that are not related to the climate. So I think a future challenge in this field is really how do we interact with other climate drivers? What are compounding effects that can happen here? And some people have already kind of advanced this concept. There is this concept of compound ecoclimatic events, because in ecosystems you have this natural variability of the ecosystem related to phenology, to biodiversity, to the structure. And this, of course, can interact with the climate variability. So you can be in bad luck, and then so like the example of the frost that happened this year. So we had this phenological development, but then we had the climate hazard on top of it. But you can think of a lot of other interactions that matter for impacts. If you think about forest management, so how do you manage a forest? This can interact with the natural variability in the weather system, but also water management. If you use up all your water for irrigation, but then you have a drought coming in that you didn't predict, then you might have a problem. Or emergency planning. I mentioned the spatially compounding event that happened. Or also finance. So more and more institutions such as the European Central Bank are getting interested in this topic to think about, can these events, if they happen in different countries in Europe at the same time, can they somehow affect the financial stability in Europe? So I wouldn't be here, and I probably wouldn't have gone through my scientific career with such success without really great mentors that I had during the last 10 years. More than 10 years now. So first and foremost, Miguel Maecha and Markus Reichstein, who were my PhD advisors at the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry in Jena. So the PhD was also done with the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems in Tübingen. Then Sonja Cerneveratne, who was my postdoc advisor at ETH and who really taught me a lot about more the land-atmosphere coupling and really climate systems. But then also Bart van den Hoek and Seth Westra, who are very close collaborators on this emerging field of compound events and who have helped shaping the community to this very dynamic and young research field that we have now. So I'm very grateful also to my group. This is already a bit outdated, the picture. It's a very dynamically changing group. But you can see we have a lot of fun also working together. And of course, I would not be able to do this research without a lot of help from different funding agencies. So with this, I would like to conclude. I hope I could convince you that the extreme climate impacts are usually a result of compounding drivers, and revealing those can really help and strongly improve our future risk estimates. But this is a challenging task. Finally, diagnosing interactions between climatic and non-climatic drivers remains a topic for future research. And this is something that I'm also looking forward to at WFZ, but also at TU Dresden with this porous system that we have learned about earlier. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for this great presentation. So it's not only high quality work you're performing, it's also high quality presentation. And I'm glad to see what you presented, and I'm really very positive that this fits very well, not only to UFZ, but also to our faculty. And there is great potential in developing new collaborations in that. Thank you very much. So, that must have initiated questions. Please, who is first?
Jakob. Jakob, thank you very much. Brilliant, very interesting, very complex. And I would also relate my first question to complexity, if I really got that right. You talked about the flood complexity, and then you looked into the catchments. That I understood so far. What I was wondering about, whether you can say also something about the complexity of the catchments, and whether and how you would possibly measure that, so that one would have also indicators, just simply spatial indicators from our topography or whatsoever, whatever makes a catchment complex, and how would you consider that? And if I may, I would even have a second question afterwards.
Yeah, so the flood complexity is actually an indicator of a, or characteristic of a catchment. So it's like, so we get for different floods, different values, and then we get the flood complexity as a metric for the catchment. But what now constitutes, so how we can figure out whether a catchment is complex or not without looking at the floods, that is still, I mean, we don't know that yet. So we have looked at some relationships. There are some relationships. The strongest that we found, I showed you, is the dryness. So drier catchments are more complex. And I think you can, if you know something about hydrological processes, I think this makes sense. But other factors like steepness, size, there are some effects there, but it's very noisy, the relationship. So we haven't really, so I think what you would like to have is you give catchment attributes in a model, and then you predict the flood complexity. And I think we haven't tried it with machine learning. You can probably do it, but really a process understanding of really what matters. Yeah, this was just published a few weeks ago anyway, so we have not done that yet.
Thank you.
You would like to respond exactly to this? So you have to wait with your second question.
Maybe, yeah. So because I also had a question to the same topic of flood complexity, because I noticed on your slide, I think 31, that there was a very high complexity in Western Germany and Belgium, where this what's called Ahrtal flood has occurred in 2021. So just to understand the method better, do you think you would have an, oh no, it's not this one, maybe one further, no, then it was 32 perhaps?
It's only these two slides.
I don't see it, maybe anyhow. Did you test whether you can get the same hotspot of flood complexity if you would have not had this very special event that occurred in 2021? What would you expect?
Yeah, so the individual catchments, I don't think we even have the Ahrtal in here. I mean, this is a very small catchment, right? I don't know if you would even have the data, the region, yeah. So in these global maps, it's very difficult to see because we have a lot of overplotting, and it can be that you have neighboring catchments that vary quite strongly in flood complexity. So it's very difficult to actually see these patterns in these global maps. But we could look at individual catchments and then, yeah, look at what you're asking basically. But I couldn't answer this now from the global picture.
Since I didn't get a simple answer to my first question, I try for another complex topic, which you would possibly much more expect from a data guy. That is on what you simply coined as data availability for your machine learning models. So if you would have, let's say, kind of data wish list, so your wishes towards data, not only their availability, but also possibly whatever, their degree of harmonization and so forth, how would you rank that? Could you come up with some requirements toward that?
Yeah, so the typical lag that we have is impact data. So data on all sorts of impacts. So we have a lot of climate observations. We have satellite data where you can derive some impact proxies. For instance, for ecosystems, you can use greening indices and so on. But for instance, for floods, I mean, I kind of talked about floods. It's not really an impact, right? It's actually a hazard. But working with impact data on floods, then you would need damage data on housing damages and so on. And this is really difficult to obtain. If you think about health impact data, this is typically very difficult. So there are these kind of global groups that collect these data sets, but they're not available usually for everybody. And it's also then usually only all case mortality data. So impact data is really the bottleneck for this type of research. And that's why we work a lot with impact models, where we can at least develop the tools and then maybe test also on real world data once we have them.
Niels.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting presentation. I would like to come to the flood impacts as well. Society is responding actually and adapting, and we could see it in Dresden that the financial impact of the flood in 2002 was some 10 billion of euro, and the same, or the flood in a similar amount in 2013 was 10 times lower. So does this disturb your analysis on the one side? And the other question is, would you be able, if you do this analysis on a global scale, just to detect how society was adapting and what was the degree of adaptation to floods because the structure of the system was modified?
Yeah, so in our case, we would not see an effect because we only look at flood magnitude and not actually at impacts, which would be what we would like to look at. But there was actually a study that did what you suggested by Heidi Kreibich in Nature, like last year or 2 years ago, where they looked at paired flood studies. So they looked at regions where you had a flood, and then flood or drought actually, and then a few years later you had another flood with a similar magnitude. And then they checked whether kind of the adaptation of the region kind of helped to mitigate the flood impacts. And in some regions they found that this is actually the case. But what they also found is that if you have a flood that has not occurred before, like an unprecedented flood, then actually you are not adapted well to this. And this is, I think, what we will have with climate change. We actually will have events that we haven't experienced, so we don't even know. I mean, usually we adapt to events that happened in the past, but then if new events happen that we have not experienced in the past, then adaptation becomes difficult. And I think for that, it's also useful to think about what was the most extreme flood in another region. Maybe we can think about kind of scenarios that could happen and then think about adaptation. So.
Okay. Thomas?
Okay. 1, 2.
Just press this button.
Yes, I have a question about the amount of process knowledge and feature engineering that is necessary to identify the input events, because they have maybe distinct patterns, have time delays and so on. And the question is more or less expert knowledge and feature engineering knowledge, or how much, or is it done by network topology like convolutional networks or something in this direction?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this is a very relevant topic, and actually kind of the core of my, so I have this young investigator group at Helmholtz that really tries to address this question. So the goal actually of my group is really to develop tools that don't need this feature engineering, that kind of learn the relevant features automatically from the data. But so far, this has been very, very difficult because you need a lot of data, and then you need to train in the right way. And so this flood complexity study, there actually was quite a bit of feature engineering involved. So you could see that we chose these 10 predictors, we chose what we predict, and so the person who did this is a hydrologist by training, but an expert also in machine learning, so that worked well here. But our goal is really to develop more kind of generic approaches where you don't need all this expert knowledge about a certain system, but can still use some machine learning tools to kind of avoid this tedious feature engineering. Yeah.
Okay, bitte.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, my question follows up quite nicely. I wanted to come back to your model validation. you showed us one slide where you tested 3 different types of approaches against each other by using an actual event and testing the ecological validity of the models, if I understood this correctly. No?
Yeah, the cross-validation strategies you're referring to?
Yeah, my question really is, because this is key and it relates to what you just said. So machine learning is only as good as the data that are fed into it. And we are talking about a part of reality that is, you know, unlike the internet or some other training realm for machine learning, that is not well defined. So it seems to me that the theory and the conceptualization needs to be built into the feeding of the machine learning model. And I see 2 dangers there. One is that, of course, we need to work with what we have. In particular, if you want to make it into nature communications and you have to go global. And that compromises very naturally the variables you're considering, because not everywhere everything is available. You know, I'm just making this guess because I have run into this problem in my work.
No, it's
and
true
so,
for our field, yeah.
So what I'm getting at is, how about, and maybe you've done this, how about starting from a purely theoretical model, conceptual model, purely based on various expertises in the environmental sciences, and, you know, a dream world. If you were able to make up, you know, the data that you needed, what would they be? And then contrast this with what's really available, and having this as, you know, a real hard validation case in a way. Of course, you cannot run the test because you don't have the data of all the theoretical, but you can see how far away you are from an ideal world of testing the complexity. Because what got me going when I looked at your validation slide was that, yes, now you validate this against one case. At least that's what I took. Maybe you had, you know, bootstrapping or whatever and did a whole lot of iterations. But, you know, if you use it against another test case with a different combination and configuration of data available, would it be the same model that results in the optimal thing? So you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think so, yeah, it's indeed... Yeah, so it's indeed really this is often a challenge. We want a model that is very general, but that then is also useful, and at the local scale, usually very general models that work at the global scale are not useful at the local scale. And also, if we just use all the data available, maybe this doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think what you're mentioning, or what you're referring to also is what is now in climate science and environmental science, there's this notion of hybrid modeling. So people try to combine machine learning with the process understanding that they have, or kind of extend process models with some aspects of machine learning, or the other way around. And there's a lot of development in that area. What we also do to really test how credible our models are is use data from simulations that come from process-based models. So where we actually then can ask the model developers, or the people who, the model developers, does this make sense what we find here, before we then apply this on real-world observations.
And maybe if I can just add, sorry, can I just add one thing? This theoretical model that I was trying to allude to is, so how can we make progress in precision, in predictive validity? It will not, so it's like a Münchhausen thing. If you think that with the things available, eventually we will get better and more precise. So what I would like to avoid is that we just turn around in the same soup again and again. And I'm about increasing whatever, the plate and the ingredients. And so that based on this work and, you know, connecting around the globe with different groups working on similar things, one could develop an argument about which type of data and which type of precision for which type of data are needed, essential, in a very short-term time frame, in order to being able to make these predictions that the European Bank wants to see and so forth. Because for me, always, the gold standard when you look across the sciences is physics. Physics has achieved to get money in a dimension that it's inconceivable. Look at CERN. And why did they do this? Because they said we have to measure this, right? But if we are not in the other sciences and disciplines develop similarly, you know, stringent arguments based on our science, we will never make that kind of progress. So, is there anything developing in this direction?
Yes, so we actually do have essential climate variables and essential ecosystem variables that have been developed because of this reasoning. So we need certain variables to be able to make certain kinds of predictions. And these are measured then, so then people build satellites, so the European Space Agency builds satellites to measure exactly that, what the scientists think they need to make these predictions. So I think in climate science, it's at the moment actually more the other way around. So our future projections are only based on physics, only based on kind of very basic physics, because these model projections, they run 100 years in the future, and we cannot use observations to make these projections, these kind of estimates for the future. But these models actually, they don't use much of the observational data that we have at the moment. So the field is more coming from the other side to use more and more of the observational data and improve the models and maybe use some machine learning to improve parts of the models to make better predictions for the future. But so far, we are largely relying on basic physics for our future climate projections.
Okay, before I have stood here for 20 minutes without doing anything, I will also ask a question, but you can take the microphone, of course. This synergetic statement you made, that the effect becomes more intense than the sum of two individual effects that would have been caused by two individual drivers. Is that a general finding, or does it occur only occasionally?
This is often difficult to measure. So I think you probably referred to the study that I did to my PhD, where I found this for drought heat events. And I think for this flood study, we could argue if you find a relevant interaction term, then we also have this effect. But if you look at observations, it's actually quite difficult to find events that only had the single driver, only had this other single driver, or had both drivers, and then make this comparison. So I think for conceptual models, yeah, but then you put in what you expect, right? So it's a bit difficult to really identify this. But I wouldn't say actually that this is. I find it difficult to make a generic statement about this. So, for instance, I think when we think about temporally compounding events, we can think about clusters of hurricanes hitting the same region. And now you might argue, okay, if you have 3 of them, it's much worse than like one of them, obviously, but is it actually much worse having 3 in a row or having 3 in different years? Because in between you build up your stuff, then you get destroyed again. So actually maybe the cumulative damage is much larger when you have them in separate years, but maybe also you reach a tipping point that you have so much destruction that then this creates some downwards cascading effects into society that then the damages are much larger. So I think in practice, this question is very difficult to answer.
Yeah, when you're dealing with extremes, you always need large data sets, that's clear. But can you say something about the importance of long-term observations versus high spatial coverage? What is more important, and which are the most important spatial observations and what are the most important long-term time series observations, perhaps?
Yeah, usually we prefer long observations to high resolution. And when we work with satellite data, we have often the opposite. We have very high resolution, but very short time series. And so with this, for instance, with this crop failure project, we also try to learn like space for time substitution. Can we actually learn from a different region about the region where we are at, because it's quite correlated? But that's not so easy because the region is correlated and then you don't have independent samples, and so this is actually quite tricky. But I think there must be ways to exploit this spatial coverage that we have, spatial high-resolution data that we have from satellites, and kind of trade it for kind of long-term observations that we usually don't have in many cases.
Okay, looking at the time that is quite advanced, I would misuse my privileged situation here and ask the last question, which is related to one of your final statements. You were trying to predict how often a hot and dry summer is going to happen with the best and worst case, and the worst case was every 4 years. Now, what is it, a hot and dry summer? Because in my memory, 2018, 19, 20, and 22 were hot and dry summers, but they were not, obviously, according.
Yeah, there were actually. So yeah, the last years in Germany, they're a bit difficult to fit into this picture because this frequency of like, or sequence of droughts, hot and dry events, 3 years, of basically 4 years out of 5, is not really what we would expect from that climate. So maybe we were just unlucky. Europe is also warming much faster than other regions, so this might be a contributor. And then, of course, really answering your question, I mean, this depends always on the threshold. So in this case, we use the threshold of a 90th percentile, so 10% of the summers are defined as hot and 10% are dry, and then depending on the correlation, you get a certain frequency. But of course, if you change this threshold, you will also change this 4 and 10 that I showed.
Okay, so if it's not only statistical, but a reference that is defined in terms of cumulative degrees and so on.
Yeah, in this case, it's simply the 10% of the summer mean temperature is defined as hot in some reference period. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much again. And now we come to a point in the agenda that was not mandatory, but we were quite creative and gave you a very special present. It's entitled Flowers, handover of flowers. That's not a flower, but it's a designed package of a ginkgo that was grown in a forest botanical garden in Tarant. So it's a tree from the forest sciences, it's soil from the landscape ecology, and it was watered from hydroscience. So that's a representation of our faculty, and please keep it.
Thank you very much.
So that was clear.